Hello and welcome to Console Shock Retro and Modern Gaming Conversation, or, well, as some people call it, chat, I believe. And as always, there's sort of two people that tend to be involved in this whole sort of Console Shock operation. Has been now for 8 years, and it is myself.
Oh, is it 8 years?
Yeah, I think it is. Well, actually 9, I guess. No, 10. Because, no, it is 10. Joining me is Stu, by the way. Hi, Stu. Yeah, so
Hi there,
10.
Oh, my.
Yeah, we did those first 2 episodes that were kind of in your shop, like videos, and then we did the Eurogamer Expo. That was all in 2013. Bloody hell!
I can't believe that. So I think we're officially the longest running video game podcast
ever. I think.
Ever.
Yeah, we've been going longer than the Retro Hour.
Put in the comments if we're wrong.
Yeah.
Put in
I
the
dare
comments,
you.
I dare you. Put in the comments if we're wrong. But we are officially the longest running video game podcast.
Yeah. Probably not just outside of YouTube, but probably in the world. I think I'm fairly confident saying. I mean, there's a lot of the people that we've had on that are very big now. Haven't been going as long as us, so they can all get screwed.
Exactly.
Really, I think
we've had some pretty big guests on here. I think GameSack, Retro Man, RMC, Kim
John
Justice, John Linneman from Digital Foundry.
Dan Wood's been on a few times.
Dan Wood, from the Retro Hour, and Ravi as well from the Retro Hour. Guys on Dreamcast, Junkyard. We had Michael Jackson, his last interview before, unfortunately, tragically died.
And Princess
We've had
Diana,
everyone on.
Well.
Everyone.
We have had all of them. Queen Elizabeth
II.
At some point.
Yeah. We've got next on Saturday. We've got Prince Charles. He's coming on, or King Charles. He's coming on.
Get it right.
Yeah, he's coming on with Camilla.
Charles Prime, I believe he will become on that day. Yes. So yeah,
Charles.
we've been around a little bit. We need to do a 10th anniversary special. But really, what are you going to do for a special as an audio podcast? We don't know all the YouTubers to be like, hey guys, come on to our show, and we'll just show off the fact that we know all of you. You know, that's normally how it works. But we're not really. We're not friends with these people. They're not friends with us. I think we're scum. I don't
think they think that, Trev.
Well, they probably do. Anyway, so we usually kick off these episodes with a kind of an overview of what we've been playing. I haven't really done that much. I'm playing a lot of new stuff, really. I've just been going back on a lot of stuff that I've already played previously. I mean, last night I was kind of playing more for the uniqueness of the situation as opposed to it being something new. But I was playing the Master Chief Collection on the Steam Deck.
Oh wow! Okay.
I'd already.
Go ahead.
I was going to say I've already completed Halo 1 and 2 on the Xbox on that same collection over the last few years. But yeah, I just thought it'd be kind of fun to do it on the Steam Deck, So but been doing
it's
that.
Really an amazing collection of games, to be honest. And I've got a friend of mine, and I always like checking people's gamer scores and things like that.
Yeah, me. You're talking about me. Yeah.
Not you, Trev. But he's got something like 7,000 gamer score. He's literally, I don't know, 2 or maybe 3/4 the amount of gamer score you can get on that game, just because of he's done all the campaigns on all different category or
online
and
stuff.
It's a huge amount.
Yeah, it wasn't great when it started. I remember that it was kind of maligned a little bit when it started. I don't think it had ODST and like reach and things like that.
It didn't have those, and I think there were sort of graphics.
There were glitchy stuff,
glitchy problems. But credit to Microsoft. They've made the effort and just kept on upgrading it, and it's got sort of legs of its own now, really. And I'd recommend anyone sort of going back to playing any of the Halo games. I don't really think there is a bad one out there.
It runs great on the Steam Deck as well, which is obviously quite a unique way of playing it, really. I guess there are ways to play, the older PC ports of the first two on sort of handheld, the sort of GPD win and things like that came before the Steam Deck, but this is a really genuinely good. And that actually brings me to a second point. I think we touched upon it a little bit in maybe the last episode, but we now know a bit more about the Asus or Asus. They hate us because they Asus ROG Ally.
Yeah.
And supposedly it's coming out. Well, initially they said May the 11th was, or what I was reading in the news, May the 11th when it was actually coming out. But now that apparently is just a day when they're going to announce more things. So I don't know if that means it's going to be still May sometime, or they're just going to say, yeah, it's coming out in October. But potentially, yeah, maybe in a few weeks, you could actually have your hands on one. Have you got any more thoughts on buying it or anything like that?
I listened to some coverage. I enjoy listening to the Digital Foundry Direct podcast, and they quite often sort of talk about that and things about that, and they're sort of quite positive about it. But the fact is, they haven't got their hands on it yet. So I think it's. It's what I predicted a few times, and I don't want to say I predict the future, but it's a lot of people have copied the Steam Deck. They've come out with very similar systems, and this one is whenever someone makes something, is people always trying to go, okay, I'll make something better, and that's what's happened here, and it's more powerful. I think it uses less power. I don't know a huge amount about it, but I certainly know it's more powerful. And they were talking about, there's rumours it's going to have a $700 price tag, so that'd probably be about £700. And someone made the point of, that's only about £100 more than the top Steam Deck. So I was actually thought, okay, that's quite exciting, and I think I like the way it moves away from having its own operating system, and it's more. You go on there, it's just like using Windows, and I think that will make it more. You won't have to make games that are particular for the Ally deck or whatever it's called, Asus Rift Ally. You can just sort of play games as you would do on a Windows computer, and to me that's a huge advantage.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually just it's running Windows 11, so it's just going to have Windows 11 on there, which basically opens it out to anything that can run on Windows, which is every PC game, basically. So it's nowhere as restrictive as the Steam Deck would be.
Exactly, you can buy games off a GOG. You can copy over. Emulated ROMs, and I mean
Game Pass
easily
will work seamlessly.
A Game Pass will work on there. You can you can play DOSBox games and things like that. So there's a huge, great, big sort of wealth of. Actually, it's a little bit easier to work with, and then it's a bit more powerful. So I think there's a huge advantage to it, and of course you can just install Steam onto it and then play all your Steam games as well. So I'm generally sort of quite excited about it. I don't think I'll be buying one on day one, but I'll be certainly interested to sort of find out more about it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and grab it probably around the time it comes out. A lot of people, like you say, were saying. Initially, though, they were kind of saying, this will definitely be over £1,000. It's not like they can't subsidize it like Steam could subsidize the Steam Deck. But £700 is really good for something that people are saying is around twice.
That's a rumor. So this will probably come out in about a week or so. So, put in the comments that's, I think I made a few jokes at the beginning, but that was a genuine sort of rumor I heard. So hopefully... That to me is the right sort of price point.
I think so. I think so. It keeps it within that Steam Deck range. You're getting quite a decent boost in performance. Twice as powerful is what some people are saying. I don't know how that will come out in the benchmarks, but maybe we're going to have a handheld console now that can almost approach maybe a Series S kind of level, which is great news for the next few years of games. They'll run. On there, obviously not the biggest settings, but there's that.
But I think the issue is you don't have to have it because it's got a lower resolution. Easy for you to say screen, So I don't know if it's 720p, but the point is, at that kind of resolution, well, you can play loads of games, really quite well. And then because it's such a small screen, it's not like, okay, I'm gonna have 720p on a 40-inch screen. It will look really like all soft edges, and you can see the pixels and things like that. It won't be an enjoyable experience, but actually on a much smaller screen, I think it'd be a really good experience. And another thing about sort of these consoles, which I almost want to sort of find a little bit more about, is the sort of the power draw from them. And it's one of those things where you go, oh yeah, well, great, this does, it's as good as Series X. It does this, it does that, but then it only lasts 45 minutes, and then, well, actually, is it fit for purpose? And I don't know how long this one would last, and I imagine it'd be similar to the Steam Deck. So if you're playing a AAA game and you've got all the settings on as high as you possibly can, and gaming mode enabled, what was it? Probably 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that.
Yeah. It was around that. Yeah. I mean, it'll probably be. It might be that, or even less, to be honest, if you run it at a higher wattage that it can do. But it's got a 1080p screen, so higher resolution than the Steam Deck. One of the great things about it, though, is you'll be able to plug it into an external GPU. So you could have like a Nintendo Switch situation where you could, but on steroids, really, where you could connect it to an external GPU, which could be like a 4060, 70, or 80, or even a 4090. And you could basically got a top of the line gaming PC that could compete with, easily surpass a PS5 or a Series X potentially.
I saw images of that, and I think on the Linus Tech Tips video, and I was like, okay, that's good, but it all sounds awful, because you're like, well, if you can't take that GPU, I suppose you could take it with you, but plug it in. So you would almost have to be sitting on the sofa with your portable gaming Ally, Asus Ally machine, and then a cable coming out of it, go into a box, which will then have to be plugged in. And it almost just goes, well, you could do it, you could plug it in, you can play it, and it's great. But then it almost takes away the, I can play it when I'm on the train, or when I'm on a flight, I can play it. Or actually, if I'm going away and I'm staying with family or something, and I can go away and sort of play it. And it's almost like, well, it's good that it does that. It's got that feature, but will people use that? Will it be? I can't imagine they'll sell many.
Well, I mean, that functionality is basically like the Switch. When you're at home, you just plug it into the dock to get it on your big TV. You'll get a bit of a boost in resolution and performance. I can imagine that's how they envision people would use. I don't know if they're going to make a proper little dock that will have the GPU connected to it, but they probably will. But yeah, you would just have it sat, somewhere that connects it to the TV with the external GPU, and that's kind of where you would use it. In that situation, obviously, you unplug it, and when you want to move to another room or go traveling, or do whatever you're doing.
I think what I was going to say is that it might be a little bit like it might be in a very expensive way to buy a desktop computer.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably going to look at another $1,000 for the GPU, but to be honest, if you're going to be getting something with a 40XX in it, certainly if you're not building it yourself, which would be a lot cheaper, but if you're going to get a pre-built machine, you're probably going to be pushing, $1.5 grand, $2 grand anyway, and that's just for a computer that stays in one place all the time. So it's probably not a terrible alternative to that. At the end of the day, you don't have to do it at all. Of course, you've just you could be perfectly happy with.
It has a TV out, doesn't it? So
you'll have a HDMI, USB-C, and everything. So I think it's really exciting. And I think what makes me kind of want to go for it, as opposed to the Iron Neo and all of that. The Iron Neos, I mean, they just constantly pump out these handhelds, and they tend to drop the previous one like an absolute brick when a new one comes out. So I'll be worried about the level of support you get with that. Whereas Asus, have been around, for a lot longer and produced laptops and gaming hardware for a long while now, and
That's it. That's exactly what
warranties and things will be better.
I was going to say.
Yeah,
Because the issue is that, Asus are making these machines, and I think what I'm excited about is, what will they be in 3 years' time? What will they be in 2 years' time? And how powerful will these machines be? And it seems almost like it's like, you sort of get one, and then in 6 months there's one that's sort of twice as powerful. I'm not trying to convince you not to get one, but it seems like it's such a fast moving sort of sphere of gaming where they're trying to catch up as much as they can with desktop gaming and laptop gaming, that it's really good that it's sort of pushing forward, and I'm just quite excited to see what's going to be happening in the future with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's perfect actually, because that kind of brings us into what we're going to talk about today. We're going to stick with the handhelds and kind of, perhaps the first example of a handheld console that, could run with the more conventional, units that you plug into your TV, the home consoles. And we've talked about it a little bit before. We did have an episode a while ago, maybe a couple of years ago now, about a sort of a general handheld episode where we sort of covered, the Game Gear and the Game Boy. But we're going to focus more in depth on one of these sort of 80s, 90s handhelds, and that's the Atari Lynx. So just to get sort of warmed up to this, what are your personal memories and experiences with the Atari Lynx, Stu?
I remember when I came from a small town in the UK, and everyone had a Game Boy. Everyone had a Game Boy. They were obviously the sort of the market leaders as we now know. But then seeing a Atari Lynx, I was like, wow. And I think they had, to me, it was an absolutely smashing machine. So going into Dixon's, they had like a display with the Atari Lynx being, you could play on it and things like that. I remember they had really good sort of vibrant adverts on TV where it looked like a really sort of, a cool machine. And the fact that it was, you sort of thought, well, hold on, why on earth would anyone ever want a Game Boy? This is like, imagine a situation where the PlayStation 5 is black and white, and has pretty good games, but it's only black and white. And then the Xbox Series X is color. It's much bigger. It's much more vibrant, and got a whole wealth of different sort of things you can do with it. And to me, it was a real sort of big impact. But I remember always sort of thinking, back in those days, it was batteries.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So it was like, oh yeah, I want one of those, but then I can't afford the batteries. And so that was what. So no, I can't get one of those. The batteries are just, I can't afford them. So I'll stick with the Game Boy. The batteries last for 18 hours.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously the big thing that also affected other color handhelds as well that tried to take on the Game Boy. The Lynx, I mean, it came out, the sort of latter quarter, I think, of 1989. I think it was about £190 in the UK when it released. It's also quite expensive. I mean, you could probably double that in today's money. And the Game Boy was under £100. So, I mean, even just that on its own was already a big factor. But what you got was a pretty powerful bit of kit. I mean, it had an 8-bit CPU, which is obviously no sort of great shakes on its own, but it had a 16-bit graphics processor. So, the sort of graphics that would be on a level of like a Mega Drive or an Amiga, not quite in the same way. But
I think it was actually
had
designed
incredible
by
hardware.
Yeah, it was designed. The hardware was designed by the same team that originally designed the Amiga. I think I'm correct in saying.
Yes,
so
you're correct.
It was actually sort of phenomenal. But then, if you think about it, the Game Boy, actually, I remember that came out. I think it was $69.99, and that came with Tetris. So if we're talking almost twice as much, or if not more, for the Atari Lynx, it was a it was a step up in sort of price.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's also the price, and yes, it was designed by R.J. Michael and Dave Needle. Is it R.J. Michael? I might have butchered that. Sorry, R.J. But yeah, they both worked on the Amiga, and they helped design the Lynx initially for a company called Epyx, who you might know that made they're probably the most famous games, California games.
That's right, yeah.
Epyx actually designed the Lynx with these two guys. They initially were going to call it the Handy, which is a really shit name. But that was what they were going to call it. But they couldn't afford to release it. They couldn't produce the hardware. Sounds like a wanking thing, doesn't it? But they couldn't release the hardware.
I was going to say, have you ever had an Epyx Handy?
Get your mind out of the gutter, Stu. This is sophisticated, highbrow podcasting we're doing here. But yeah, it does sound a bit like wanking, which is kind of funny. I love those sort of jokes. But yes, so those guys designed it. Epyx couldn't basically manufacture it; they didn't have the money or the means to do that. So they kind of shopped it around, and they landed with Atari, who obviously have quite a pedigree with gaming at this point in the late 80s, even though they were already kind of faltering at that point, I would say. And they actually ended up buying the rights to it. Basically, I think Epyx kind of went bust shortly after that. So that ended up meaning that Atari basically were completely in charge then of the Handy. Though they initially called it the Portable Color Video Game System when it was announced, I think in the 1989 Consumer Electronics Show. And it wasn't called the Lynx then, but when it actually came out in September of '89, it was actually officially called the Lynx, and that kind of referred to the fact you could connect multiple Lynxes up for multiplayer up to 16, I think. I'm sure there was a game that allowed for that, but you could do that in theory. But yeah, I mean, probably the most unique thing about it was the fact it had a color screen.
Yes.
The first color handheld games console. So obviously you can trace, your Steam Decks, your Asus ROG Allies all the way back, having a color screen. And even that form factor, that wide D-pad on one side, fire buttons on the other side of the screen, that form factor that is now so prevalent and has been for a long time, that you could trace that all the way back to the Atari Lynx. So, there were like Game & Watch and things like that did kind of have that. But in terms of a dedicated, real console that wasn't an LCD liquid crystal, have very basic graphics kind of deal. It all started with the Lynx, but yeah, very powerful graphics capabilities. Was kind of odd in the sense that it didn't really use tiles and sprites like, a NES or a Master System or a Mega Drive or a Super Nintendo. It kind of mainly just used sprites, but it could do scaling of those sprites.
Yeah.
So you had some games like a really good one that shows that off is Blue Lightning, which is based like a sort of a slow-paced afterburner game, which is actually very good. That's got like the landscape and the clouds and the aeroplanes you're fighting scale towards the screen, not in a jerky sort of juddery way when they try to simulate that on the Mega Drive or the other consoles, but it's perfectly smooth. And that's something that, most systems in that day couldn't do at all. And here's this handheld that could do it. And really, it was like they sort of marketed it initially. The sort of game, the sort of hero game, you could say, that they tried to sort of sell it with was California Games. Which I do have fond memories of on other platforms, mainly the Master System version, I think, was the one that a lot of people played in this country. But it's not a great game. Do you remember California Games, Stu?
I don't know. It's one of those games where, when you're young, you're almost sort of tricked by marketing. And you always saw videos. Someone was surfing. They were kicking the ball. They were on their BMX.
Yeah.
And it always like, oh, that looked good. That looks really good. And I remember playing it and just going, what am I doing? How do I keep this hacky sack in the air? And it was never something that, maybe I didn't really give it a big enough of a try. But Epyx, they had their big series, didn't they? Something Games, Winter Games, California Games.
Yeah. Exactly.
Stadium Game. I can't quite remember the other ones, but that was their sort of series, and so that was like the flagship game that you got with it. But I mean, it always had. Sort of going back to the graphics, I remember being quite overwhelmed with. There was a sort of a 3D flying game, sort of based in like the First World War on biplanes or something.
Warbirds, yeah, Warbirds.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I was actually like, oh god, this looks. It's like something you would get on the Amiga. Probably looking back now, you go, no, it doesn't, Stuart. Looks a bit shit. But actually, it was just something you wouldn't get on the Game Gear, and obviously you wouldn't get on the Game Boy. And things like, I think the sort of Batman Returns. There was so much depth in the characters. The sprites were really large, and it was a really sort of impressive machine, really. But we'll probably go on to it, but maybe it was sort of let down by the game library that it had.
Yeah, I'd say that's kind of fair. It's got a very unique game library. There's not many multi-platform games. It's difficult to say where its strength lies, really, in terms of genres. The Game Boy, you could say it's got great RPGs and platform games. Like each of them you could name dozens potentially. I mean, the library in general, it's only I think it's a shade over 70 games versus just under 700, I think, for the original sort of Game Boy, going up to the Color, Game Boy Color. But yeah, I mean, has it really got a lot of? There is one genuinely good platform game on it. You've got quite quirky things like Scrapyard Dog and Gordo 106 and probably Rygar or actually Ninja Gaiden 3, actually. They're both pretty good. The latter, Ninja Gaiden, is kind of a port of the NES Ninja Gaiden 3. In fact, it is literally a port. It's identical to it. So it's a little bit harder to see on the smaller screen. And the Lynx that have, despite the fact it was color, which is super awesome, and backlit, it's quite blocky because it had quite a low resolution, actually lower than the Game Boy. Although it was actually quite wide. I think it's maybe what sort of 3:2 aspect ratio. So it was quite wide, quite a wide screen, which it took advantage of in a lot of games. But yeah, I mean, in terms of games that a lot of people would be familiar with, it got Lemmings, which is a pretty good port. You've got Desert Strike, which is pretty good. California Games we've already mentioned, although I wouldn't say that's the best version of the game. It's actually missing a couple of the events. Warbirds is pretty good, like a dogfighting game. Road Blasters, Rygar, Shadow of the Beast, port of the Amiga game. Pretty good port, though I don't think Shadow of the Beast is actually that good a game, generally. Double Dragon. Some of the games a lot of people remember aren't actually that good as well. I mean, Batman Returns, that's a pretty crap game. Although I do remember liking it when I got my Atari Lynx. It came with it. Probably because it came with it, but yeah.
I think that's my point, really, is that you sometimes having all the power in the world, having the most powerful handheld, it doesn't make up for bad gameplay or bad game design or not the right characters. And it's quite interesting when you're going through that list. None of those games, I thought, I really remember that fondly. Like maybe when you said Double Dragon, I thought, I used to like Double Dragon. Yeah, but the point is that was on everything anyway. And I don't think anyone ever said that the Lynx version is the iconic version of Double Dragon that everyone remembers. No, it probably isn't.
Yeah,
well, it definitely isn't. But the whole issue is that there's no Super Mario Land, and I think we've talked about it in the past. Tetris, that's a real system seller.
Yeah.
And even when you get down back to the Game Gear, Sonic 2, Sonic Chaos, and Columns, and all these great games of IPs that you just really knew, where Scrapyard Dog, it didn't have that. And it was quite funny, I clicked on it when you said it, and it had such awful artwork. It's like a boy sitting next to some sort of dog.
I didn't do him any favors, really, that kind of stuff as well, the artwork.
So it's just like, well, it's almost just lacking. And
I'll probably say it's kind of, there isn't really a standout game that you could point to and say, and people would universally agree, get it just to play that. With like the Lynx, you could probably say that maybe arcade ports are where its strength lies.
Yeah.
You've got things like Toki and in say arcade ports that you like sort of 80s and early 90s Atari arcade machines, and there's a
Yeah.
few others that you can name, but like Battlezone has got a good version. Robotron 2084 is great on the Lynx. Rygar we've already mentioned. It's got some Gauntlet. Rampart, Rampage. So yeah, a lot of those sort of Atari Xenophobe, Atari arcade games, Hydra, even some other ones that aren't Atari like Pac-Land, Hard Driving as well, which is a pretty terrible game on everything, but yeah, it's on the Lynx. Kind of impressive actually that one because it's polygon sort of graphics on like a handheld. So it's Steel Talons as well. That's actually pretty good. I actually quite like Steel Talons. But yeah, you probably would say it was kind of like a portable arcade machine almost. Is probably how I would best describe it. I mean, but yeah, like the library does kind of let it down to say, despite it's generally considered a failure. It did kind of trundle along for a good sort of 5-6 years. I mean, it came out in '89. I think its last sort of commercial release was 1995.
Oh wow!
So I mean, obviously the game releases have come to a trickle at that point, and not that they were ever huge, Anyway, I mean, 70 games ish on the Lynx, you'd get that in a year on the Game Boy. Even the Game Gear is able to sort of point to sort of 300 games, and you can add a few more on top of that with the Master System compatibility. But yeah,
I'm actually this is quite funny. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, a list of games, and the third to last game was Battle Wheels, came out in 1993, and there was no games in 1994, and then 2 came out in 1995.
It's insane.
I'm like, oh my, what was the one about 1994 then? Did they go, oh, we'll give it another go, we'll release some games, or
I think by that point, I think Atari. I said there wasn't a lot of third-party support, nowhere near what like the Game Boy got. It was mostly Atari sort of outsourcing. A lot of their games they already had licenses to, like things like Pac-Land and things that had appeared on other Atari stuff. Things that appeared on the 7800. Things that we would see on the Jaguar, maybe some stuff that was already on the Atari ST. And they'd occasionally snag the odd sort of, famous third-party thing like Lemmings, for example, and Desert Strike, which are both very good versions, actually. So, yeah, I think by 94, they were kind of slowly... There was a managed sort of closure of the Lynx, I would say. But still, it had a much longer on like the 32X and even like the Mega CD. It probably has less games than like the Mega CD, actually. But... yeah, I mean that was really a couple of years.
What's your opinion of the marketing?
I do remember one of the adverts in the UK. I think we just got like an English narrated version of the ad where the kids are playing Gauntlet and the main guy wins. And the other ones are sort of burning skeletons. I thought that was kind of cool.
Because they always used to show it, and there'd be one kid at one end, one kid at the other end, or maybe they're playing sort of something else. So they weren't holding it how you would normally think you would hold it. They were holding it in a sort of an unusual way. And,
that is actually you can play some games in kind of a Tate mode. There are some games like Tate mode, Tate and Lyle mode. So you can play.
I don't even know what's right. I don't know if I'm joking or you're joking. I've got no
idea.
Clue.
By the law of averages, we'll get there. But yeah, there's
something right, maybe.
There's a handful of games, like Gauntlet is one of them, and Raiden. Actually, there's quite a good port of Raiden where it actually makes use of the sort of the width of the screen, but vertically, and you can hold it in that way. It's a little bit awkward to hold in that way, I think. But yeah, there's some games that actually do that, and that's what I think in that advert they're playing Gauntlet. So yeah, that's a game you play in that vertical orientation, and you can also flip the screen upside down and play it with the D-pad on the right side, which I've never thought that is like. I can't imagine anybody ever doing that, but it's kind of a nice feature for people that like having the D-pad on the right side. So yeah, they're kind of forward-thinking features there, really. I mean, things like the Evercade, does the vertical thing. I think there's some PSP games. I think maybe tried to do that.
There's a few shooters and stuff which
Yeah,
went into Tarte mode.
yeah,
But yes, I was really impressed with that, and they always made a big thing about 4 people could play together,
yes,
and that to me was like, oh wow, that looks really good. You could do that on the Game Boy, but it certainly looked like a better proposition. But still talking about games is, I didn't actually realise, but there's been a huge, there's 56, also a huge 56 unlicensed games. So, to give you an idea, so since 1994, there was, every year there's about sort of 3 or 4 games that come out, things like Raiden, in 97, and I wouldn't say that's an unlicensed game. That's a pretty sort of well-known
yeah, like
series
a
of
professionally
games.
produced game. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Crystal Mines 2, I think that's familiar. Centipede came out again in 2003. Load Runner 2008. Solitaire, Eye the Beholder. We all remember that one from the Amiga.
Yeah, yeah,
Flappy Bird in 2017,
of course.
and yeah, so the last one that came out in March the 31st, 2021. So people have seen sort of benefits of sort of releasing games for the, obviously they're fan-made games or sort of ports of, other systems. I can't imagine they're dedicated Atari Lynx games, but it's always good. I always like to see how these old consoles are really, people sort of love them so much that they'll keep on releasing games for them.
Yeah, it's got a really good homebrew community, and I think games are on an ongoing basis now being developed for it, which is great. Great to see. I hope it carries on. Really helps to expand the library. But it's interesting, like when we look at the marketing. I remember when I had a bunch of sort of 1990 and 1991 issues of Amiga format. I remember seeing like double page spreads of the Atari Lynx being advertised. I guess literally Atari paying weirdly, to have something in an Amiga magazine. But obviously the Lynx, wasn't seen to be a rival of the Amiga, especially people. I think they thought people would buy it as a companion kind of device.
Yeah, obviously the
very
Amiga
expensive
was,
one, but yeah.
Yeah, the Amiga was a computer, and the Atari Lynx is, a portable gaming machine. But I mean, what's your thoughts on the Atari Lynx 1 and the Atari Lynx 2? To me, the Atari Lynx 2 looks really cheap. I don't like the plastic. Not my cup of tea. But the Atari Lynx 1, that's the machine for me.
Yeah, it's funny because I didn't even realize there was a Lynx 1 for the longest time. I've mentioned before when I was a kid, yeah. My childhood Lynx, it was a Lynx 2, which I do quite like the look of. I think it looks kind of cool. I think it looks better than the Game Gear, actually. Really sort of, it looks like a games console and not a toy. Almost like a Mega Drive. Not well, there was a Mega Drive handheld, the Nomad, but it almost looks like what the Mega Drive should have looked like if it was a handheld. Very angular.
It looks very aggressive, doesn't it?
Yeah. Very
I think
harsh angles. Yeah.
Yeah, I still prefer the Lynx 1, but
I do like the Lynx 1 as well. But I remember I used to collect, American. I still collect American comics, but when I was from the age of about 5, I used to get American comics, and after I got to the age where I started getting into video games, this is about 1991, 92 time, and I became aware that what various systems were around, and there's handhelds, there's computers, there's everything. I remember sort of fixating on handhelds a little bit because they were more within the price range of what my parents would be able to get me. And I remember thinking the Lynx would be really cool because it's 16-bit. You kind of say it isn't really 16-bit; it's just the graphics. But that was how they marketed it. It's 16-bit, like a Super Nintendo is. And to an extent, it can do a lot more. It might be closer to the Mega Drive than the Super Nintendo in terms of its performance than the Game Gear and the Game Boy. But yeah, and I thought that was the Lynx. The Lynx 2 was just the only Lynx that's ever been. I remember when like going back through my comic collection, and on the back cover, so many like issues of comics I had of any of whatever random superhero you could name. There was tons of advertising for the Lynx One. I remember there was this one that reappeared often, and it was the Lynx One, and it just had $99 now only $99. And I remember thinking, oh my god, there's like a different. They got a different Lynx in America. Then I found out later that was the current one is the Lynx 2 because a lot of the catalogs over here didn't call it the Lynx 2. It was just the Lynx. And then, when I started to, pick up old issues of magazines and things that I'd find in charity shops, like Amiga format, that's actually the Lynx One. And, that was discontinued in, I think, 91. Although I thought you could probably still buy it by the end of 91. I think the Lynx 2 completely, it didn't instantly stop selling them. But yeah, no, I like the Lynx One. And the one that I have modded, which we've spoken about actually today, is actually a Lynx One. Even though I think it's I think a lot of people would say the Lynx 2 is the better option because it's easier to take apart, and I've had some troubles with that myself lately. But yeah, I do like the look of the Lynx 1, but I couldn't tell you which one I think I prefer the look of. The Lynx 1 looks kind of almost closer to what a handheld would look like now, doesn't it, in a weird way? The rounded corners, and I'm not going to say it looks like a Steam Deck or anything, but it's that... In a way, I think it's kind of closer to that, isn't it, than maybe the Lynx 2 does?
Yeah, I think you're right there, but I think it's one of those things. Is when the Lynx came out, it was that's how I always sort of remembered it. And but I think the Lynx 1, you put the games in an unusual way, so you have to lift up a flap, if I remember, on the left hand side or the right hand side.
Yeah, that's right.
Games in, but then the Lynx 2 had
just a standard
on the back of the machine. You would sort of slide the games in as you would do a Game Gear or a Game Boy. So I think maybe that was slightly better, but I think I want to say the Lynx 2 was maybe a little bit more reliable because I remember.
Batteries will last a bit longer, as I think you get an extra hour.
Oh, well, that's worth a lot just in itself. But I remember obviously when I was very young, I went to a boot fair and I bought an Atari Lynx from this boot fair sort of back in Dover, and I was like, oh wow, this is really cool. And I brought a load of games with it. The guy was selling it quite cheap as a bundle, but then there was something wrong with it because you had to put the games in and they would only work if you held the cartridge in a certain way. So you couldn't actually use the console because you had to hold the cartridge in a certain way.
Oh my god!
So I was like, oh no, I've been done. And of course, I bought it from a boot fair, so I can't remember whatever happened to that machine though. But that's how I was.
The cartridges as well are like, well, they're not even cartridges, are they? They're kind of cool in themselves. I used to think I was really impressed by them. They're just basically like PC Engine Hue cards. They're very similar technology to that, just a very thin card. And I kind of made me think that surely all handhelds should use this, right? This is cool. I don't think they're any more limited than the regular sort of cartridges. I think that game size wise, I think they're pretty comparable to anything that came out on the Game Boy or the Game Gear. A lot of games have sound like voice samples and things like that, which traditionally would have taken up a lot of space in those days. Like Lemmings on the Lynx has the little cute "Let's Go" sound, which you don't get on the other handhelds. So little blemishes like that, though, that you could fit into those really cool cards. They got a bit easier when they released the curved lip versions that were the sort of lip at the top of the cartridge, so it was easy to sort of take out. But yeah, the Lynx 1, it just had the regular kind of little slot in the back, like the other handhelds that you pop the game in, whereas the Lynx 1 had this funny little flap. Although it's not so sort of detrimental these days, because one great modern accessory for the Lynx is an SD card, a flash cart. I've got one called the El Cheapo SD.
The El Cheapo.
The El Cheapo SD. So a guy called Ben Venn, who you might have heard of.
I've heard of that name,
yeah. He does like screen mods, not just for the Lynx, but for all the handhelds. I think other kind of, upgrades. There's actually a UK distributor called Z Labs, who you might have heard of, that have these, and it's only about £50, I think, which is quite cheap for a flash cart. But yeah, you just load up Lynx ROMs on it, on an SD card, stick that in the El Cheapo SD Lynx cartridge. It's the same size as a regular, those sort of card-like. I don't think they have a special name, do they? They're called just cards on the Atari Lynx, and you just pop it in, and obviously you won't really need to take it out again. In fact, you can just, you can remove the SD without really needing to take the entire cartridge out. So you can alleviate any sort of, cartridge loading issues that the Lynx one had by using that. And that's a great thing as well. I've really enjoyed sort of exploring a lot of the Lynx library that I never really did when I was a kid, because I only had a handful of games when I was a kid with my Lynx too. And there's other things as well, like probably my favorite mod that I've recently got was the McWill upgraded LCD screen, which is brilliant. It literally alleviates probably the most difficult reason to play the Lynx these days, and that is the screen. Obviously, when we were kids, it was just what was available. We didn't really think anything of it, and we just played. I played for hours on my Atari Lynx off that very blurry, low contrast, slightly ghosted kind of appearance LCD screen. But that was what the Game Gear wasn't really any, but I think the Lynx probably had a slightly better screen than the Game Gear, if anything. But now that problem is solved. You can drop in, there's even a solderless version of this mod now.
Oh, really?
You can just open up your Lynx, take the old screen out, and they're fairly easy to open. Put the new screen in. I've been able to do it myself, and I'm no technician by any stretch. Drop the new screen in, button it up, and you've got yourself a beautiful, vibrant, modern LCD screen that looks great, and it consumes much less power than the original screen. It's still obviously backlit, so you can play it in pitch dark, you can play it really in more ranges of light these days than you could the old one, and it uses a lot less power, so the batteries last longer. You probably get through another 3 or 4 hours. But there's also like power cables that allow you to connect it to a USB power bank. So much like people do like Steam Decks now and Nintendo Switches, when they want to, they're not near a wall, but they want to be able to have portable power. There's cables that allow you to do that with the Lynx. I think from a decent sized power bank, you'll probably get about, 15, 20 hours of power. It was never really an issue for me as a kid, though. The whole, you need to keep buying batteries, because I played it at home nearly the whole time. For me, it was a console I didn't have to need a TV for, because the TV, until I got my own TV when I was a bit older, when I was an older kid, when I was sort of 10 or 11, I think I got my own sort of hand-me-down TV from my parents. I didn't have a means of playing. I had to wait for my parents to finish with the TV to be able to play my NES or my Mega Drive. Whereas the Lynx, I could just play it anytime, anywhere I wanted to. Kind of the argument that I have with the Steam Deck now, why I love it so much. I can just pick it up and play it anywhere. Okay, I might have to tether myself to a power jack, but I haven't got to, hunch over a desk or wait for a TV to be available. I can play those games, and so yeah, I was quite happy with that. And honestly, it's too big, really, to be taking around. I mean, sure, if you're in a car, or a train or something, but you're not going to be, I wouldn't feel comfortable. You can't fit it in your pocket, so you're not going to casually throw it in your bag and go to the park and play it, like you do in the adverts for these things. But the Game Boy wasn't ideal for that either, really. It was much better. You're more likely to do it with the Game Boy, absolutely. But it's still a bit of a chonk of a device.
Chonk.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, I mean that's it. It comes back to sort of the original point, doesn't it? That the games weren't. I think we'll all be talking about the Atari Lynx differently if Epyx sold it to Nintendo and there wasn't the Game Boy.
Yeah.
We'll be going, oh, do you remember Tetris on the Nintendo Lynx? Oh, wasn't it great? And I think that's the reality of it. It just didn't have the games to satisfy people, and there just weren't the quality of games that people sort of demanded, and the characters that people wanted, and I mean another interesting point around that time. I mean, from what I remember, all the best games were coming out of Japan, and on the Atari Lynx, I think a handful of games came from Japan.
Yeah,
Not
they're mostly
not
American developed, I think, and European developed. Yeah,
exactly. So there are so many sort of American developed games, and actually, what people wanted was, Contra. They wanted Mega Man. They wanted
RPGs and
and there was certainly none of
beat 'em
those.
ups, and a lot of this stuff
eh,
was the best stuff was from Japan at this point in time. Absolutely.
Exactly, and we mentioned Mario and so on, but there was just none of that, and it had. I don't know. I always just think if I had an Atari Lynx in front of me now, I wouldn't be sure what game I would play, to be honest.
Yeah, I think if you're a fan of like 80s and 90s kind of Western arcade games, especially when if a lot of those are Atari made, you'll probably really love the Lynx because a lot of those are on the Lynx and they're pretty good ports. Beyond that, you're going to struggle a little bit. There obviously are multi-plat games I've mentioned like Ninja Gaiden and like Desert Strike and Lemmings. And there are probably there were better places even at the time to play that. And yeah, there was a Game Gear version of that. There was a Game Boy version, and so you can get either of them, and you have all the other games that they come with. So the games library, it's fairly decent quality though. There's not many outright duds. It's kind of like the 32X, I would say. Such a small library, but it's mostly average to good, to very good. I wouldn't say this is an absolute, 10 out of 10 game. There's lots of 6, 7s, and 8s, I would say, on the Atari Lynx.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, expensive initially, as we already touched upon. I mean, that got alleviated a little bit fairly shortly after. I mean, mentioned already that it was £189. That was more than like a Mega Drive, I think, when it came out. In 1989, I think the Lynx was about 1990 over here when it actually landed with us.
I've probably mentioned this story before, but when I was at university, I worked in game in Kingston, and this was probably 2000, maybe 1999, 2000, and in the game they had sort of like suddenly they had a retro section because they managed to get hold of some Atari Jaguars and Atari Lynxes as sort of ex stock. And I remember going in there, and then on the first week, Atari Jaguars were 79, and Atari Lynxes were maybe £69. Then the next week, they thought, oh God, we haven't sold anything. They were 59 and 49, and then I think they eventually went down to about £30, and this was like brand new in stock machines, and I think they had a few games there as well. So I wish I'd gone back and bought one in sort of mint condition for about £30. But I remember a company called Telegames managed to get hold of, I think they seem to publish quite a few games for the Atari Lynx and the Atari Jaguar as well. And it just sort of, there wasn't really that sort of excitement about it, but it was always sort of good sort of seeing those machines again. And it's always sort of funny when new old stock appears on eBay of something, or you think, oh wow, it's still sealed. Oh my God, this guy's got 100 of them. What's going on? And I wonder where they came from. What factory what warehouse they've been sitting in for 20 years. But yeah, I wish I brought a few more games from there.
Yeah, that's kind of how I got my Lynx. I mean, it was around 1994. I think the Special Reserve mail order catalogue I probably managed to get themselves a couple of pallets worth of them from Atari when they were liquidating them, and they were selling them for 30 quid with Batman Returns. And I begged my dad to look, this is cheaper than a game. I would love to have a Lynx. I've wanted one for years, which was true because I thought they were just cool. 16-bit handheld and all that stuff I've already mentioned. And yeah, he got me one. It's the one I still have to this day, and I loved it. I picked up a few more games over the years. But yeah, like the price, yeah, that was a big factor. I think it was fairly quickly down to about £100 within sort of 2 years. I remember already by 1992, the adverts were already saying it was £99 with a game. I think a little bit cheaper than the Game Gear was. It was kind of in between the Game Boy and the Game Gear in that sense. Pretty good value for money for the specs, really, when you think it is, more powerful than a Game Gear. But then you don't get Sonic the Hedgehog, so people might happily pay that extra to have those sort of games. So yeah, there's that. There's the battery issue. People wanted longer battery life so they could take it outdoors and not have to buy batteries constantly. That was a factor. The size, it was quite a big thing. Slightly smaller than like a Steam Deck is now, but at the time, marketing it to kids who want to take it to school and play their mates on their lunch break, it wasn't really practical for that. In terms of the size and the batteries. And the final bit, as you've touched upon, Stu, quite a bit already, the games, unless you're really into 80s and 90s Atari arcade machines, and with a few other semi-famous ones, and famous ones as well, like Missile Command and Battlezone and Ms. Pac-Man, which are on the Lynx. There's not a lot else. There's a few sort of multi-plats, not very many. Certainly not at the amount that like the Game Gear got, for example. But at the same time, there's lots of unique, weird, quirky games that didn't come out really like anywhere else and have kind of just stayed on the Lynx. I mean, now you've got like the Evercade has a couple of Lynx collections. I think
I've seen those.
Yeah. But things like a Scrapyard Dog that I've already mentioned, Stun Runner and Road Blasters, and games that just Warbirds, Viking Child, Turbo Sub, Hydra, Zalom, Mercenary, Gates of Zendikon, Electro Cop. These games didn't really appear anywhere else apart from on the Lynx. So there are some genuinely unique experiences on the Lynx. I mean, you could say that about the Game Boy and the Game Gear themselves, but I think most people played multi-plats and like your famous Sega and Nintendo franchises on those systems. So, would I recommend someone get one now? Yes and no, really. I mean, it's probably a bit different for us. We have some nostalgia, especially, we both own them. It's a great part of my childhood. I loved my Lynx 2. And I've really enjoyed kind of with the Lynx 1 that I've got a hold of with the screen mod and the SD card, flash cart. I'm able to enjoy, a lot of games that I didn't before. I know you could play them on emulators and things like that, but there's always just something special about playing this stuff on the original hardware. So it's been really enjoyable for me. I think if you weren't around at the time, you're younger than us, and you aren't into the Game Boy is probably as far as you go in terms of nostalgia for this sort of thing. I don't think the Lynx is probably going to be that appealing, other than as a historical important thing being the first color handheld. Really, I mean, what are your final thoughts on the Lynx?
I think the same is, potentially it's a missed opportunity. I mean, it could have been so much better, but I think it'll be one of those things. If you want to try one, then try and find someone who's got one to sort of give it a go, because I think it might be in
or
this
get the
day and
Evercade,
age,
the Evercade collections,
exactly, or try an emulator on your PC. I think that'll be the first route to go, because I imagine the screen doesn't, unless it's been modified, really probably doesn't look very good, and all the games look really washed out and things like that. And obviously that's the same problem with the Game Gear. Probably not the Game Boy, actually. Their screens seem to hold up sort of pretty well, but I would say go down the emulation route, and then actually go, and then if you really like it, then invest in one. And I can't imagine they're sort of too expensive. I don't know if you might know the answer to this, Trev, but are there any games that are, if you get that game, it's £100, or are they?
I think some of the very final releases, like Lemmings, is one people cite often has been quite difficult to get hold of. I don't know if it's like it's probably about £100-200 game in good condition. Like the ones that we've mentioned, like Raiden, and there's a weird one called Fat Bobby, which is a terrible name for a game, but that is a very late release. Double Dragon, another late one.
Yeah.
Basically, that sort of 1994, 95, that handful of games that appeared around then were released in very small quantities. So they'd be they are quite expensive. But yeah, you have to be a real Lynx like nut to be willing to go.
Yeah.
You can get fairly cheap, just the loose cards. You know, CEX have quite a decent, bunch of Lynx games. If you look online, they can sell to you that mostly, 10, 20 pounds. Kind of redundant unless you're planning on collecting them. I mean, realistically, there's not that many Lynx games, so you could go for a full set. It would cost you a lot less than doing the same for a Game Boy or a Game Gear or a Mega Drive or any kind of console that had any kind of a longevity. The Lynx did have a 6-year kind of run, really. We just didn't get very many games over that period. But yeah, you would hit a handful of games that would be over £100, unless you want to go for a loose game card. But yeah, it's not really it's a bit of a niche of a niche of a niche. I would say it's not like a console people talk about in terms of the collecting world, apart from fans that were fans growing up. Like me, really. Though I don't really have a big desire to go and get all the games. I probably would just get them all loose as well. I watched recently while I was waiting for this new Lynx that I got to arrive. I watched Ashens did a review of the Lynx quite a few years ago. And he said he's got all the games apart from one or two, and he literally just threw them onto his couch, and it's just a big pile of cards. So probably quite easy to store if you do happen to get the lot. I mean, the consoles themselves aren't cheap. You could get a vanilla Lynx 2 with just the original screen for okay condition for about 130, 40, 50 pounds. If you can get a pre-modded one for about 200. So, it's not super cheap. Compare that to probably what a DMG Game Boy would be. I think it's probably still 30, 40 pounds for one of them. But then there's, 70 million of them versus 2 or 3 million, I think, of the original Lynx in terms of how many got sold. So, yeah, there's absolutely no comparison, really. But anyway, Stu, you're going to try and grab one for yourself now?
No. There
we go.
Trev, it wouldn't get used. I think I'll follow my own advice, and I think if I want to play one, I'll download an emulator in the blink of an eye, plug in a controller, and I think that'll be the way to go.
Yeah, I would say an EverDrive and get the Lynx collections. That's a pretty good way to kind of experience it in a similar fashion that you would have done on a handheld device.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
The low resolution sort of Lynx games don't look brilliant blown up on a ginormous screen.
I can imagine they look awful.
Yeah, extremely blocky. I mean, you could kind of argue the Game Boy doesn't really either, so it's not a knock on the Lynx particularly. It's kind of 90s handheld sort of quirk with the limited screens that we had back then. Would have been interesting to see. I don't think Atari could have done anything. I think it was kind of doomed, really, from the off being with Atari. They were already well into their era of mishaps. I think they did a decent job of the Lynx. Would have been interesting to see what Nintendo or Sega could have done with that same hardware. We could have got some incredible games that would have rivaled,
exactly. That's my point. It's just, Nintendo at that time and Sega, just dominated the games market, and no one was thinking, old 2600 or 7800 Atari, and it just wasn't in people's minds. It was all about the Game Boy, the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive. That's what people sort of wanted to play, and unfortunately the Atari Lynx and didn't quite cut it, really.
No, unfortunately, but hopefully more homebrew will come out, and the games will still continue to support it. And I don't think we've got potentially a long afterlife, ahead of it. Which is awesome, and it's great about a lot of old consoles, but the Lynx really deserves it because of the tough life it had when it was in the mainstream. But But anyway, Stu, where can you find us?
We are everywhere. So consoleshock.net for the website. Any sort of podcast client, search for Console Shock. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, search Console Shock. And so Twitter, follow us on there. And tweet at me. I sort of manage that. So, and put a message under the video. We like to sort of know you're listening. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, check us out on all of those podcast catchers and social medias. And thanks for listening again, as always. And we will catch you in the next one. Take care.
Take it easy. Bye bye.